Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'm actually going to be talking about some new work today. It's still in its formative stages, but why not? Why not take some risks? Because I'm a historian, and risks, believe it or not, is what historians take all the time. History is always about risk-taking. It's about taking scraps of evidence, finding the connections, and crafting a story of the past that's ultimately unknowable in all of its dimensions. It's also about curiosity and speculation and multiple possibilities. So in pulling together some new work for this talk this afternoon, I've actually had to grapple not just with the United States in the 19th century, but with how we write history to begin with. Now, the French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Laverie once said, there are two kinds of historians, parachutists and truffle hunters. Now, the first float down from the clouds, surveying a broad panorama, and the latter snuffled around in the dirt. He didn't really elaborate, but we can easily, I think, infer what he meant. The parachutist discerns large patterns, tracks events or people or pathogens across vast stretches of time and space. You have to be a parachutist to see how old world germs or animals reshape the new world. You have to have that elevated perspective to track, say, the recurring patterns of anti-Semitism in Western culture. But you can miss things from up there too. From up high, it's all too easy to flatten out the variations that occur across space and time, to convey with any visceral excitement the stuff that's happening down on the ground. What do I mean? From the Space Shuttle Endeavour, for example, you might be able to see the smoke plume from a troublesome volcano in Iceland or in Chile. But you'd be hard-pressed to understand what trouble that caused to the people stuck in an airport in Rome or in Auckland, frantic about missing a wedding or a deathbed farewell. You'd be hard-pressed to see how those people responded to the problem, adapted, or made choices within a particular set of constraints. But those very specific local circumstances are what truffle hunters are best at rooting out. Truffle hunters know how to get the lay of the land. And if they might sometimes miss the big picture, they're really good at ferreting out the small details. So I'm going to confess to you right now, I'm afraid of heights. I'm a truffle hunter. And I'm not asserting this as a superior kind of historical practice. It's simply what I like to do. I have to follow my own nose. Now, the project I'm talking about today began as I thought about whether some very specific local stories might help me rethink the interconnections between the Civil War and Reconstruction era and America's westward expansion, which are two episodes of American history generally confined to different chapters in the textbook, and all too seldom thought about in tandem. I plan to begin with a handful of photographs by the Scottish immigrant Alexander Gardner, who was witness to some of the most momentous events of the 1860s. The Civil War, the Lincoln presidency, the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. Like so many military figures and civilians, Gardner then went west after the war, where he photographed the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Indian Wars. I plan to look at the events themselves, to follow some of the characters in these photographs, and to think hard about the memories and experiences they brought to these signal moments. Gardner, I knew, wasn't the only person who experienced this turbulent decade of the 1860s from the multiple perspectives of an eastern battlefield and a western prairie, who witnessed a war fought to give freedom to African Americans, then another aimed at restricting the freedoms of Native Americans. Now, the challenge of being a truffle hunter, as one approaches a project like this, is twofold. You have to find the truffles, and then you have to make sense of them. Ultimately, the historian needs to bring her pieces home, figure out how they fit together, think about how they speak to larger issues, and then resort to her historical imagination to write a story. Because small scraps of evidence don't tell stories. Historians do. So I want to lead you into the truffle fields here, start with one of my pictures, and try to tell a story. We're in Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory, May 1868. Alexander Gardner sets up his camera, pushing the tripod legs down into the hard-packed dirt. Behind him stand his wagon and portable dark tent, not far from the cluster of teepees and tents where he's been photographing the assembled Indians and government agents for the past few days. The calendar says it's spring. But even in May, in this troubled year of 1868, the northern plains show scant signs of green. And nature's bleak aspect matches the moods of the federal peace commissioners and the chiefs gathered in Fort Laramie. The peace commissioners hope to make the assembled tribes accept a Great Sioux Reservation, the northern counterpart to the restricted plot of land they forced the southern tribes to accept the year before. Then Kansas and Nebraska will be free of Indian threats, creating a circular corridor to the far west. At first glance, this photograph would seem to have nothing to do with the Civil War, concluded some 3 years before. But it's actually a piece of the same story. The end of the war means that captains of industry can divert money into the transcontinental railroad projects, and those projects can proceed forward without the contentious debates about slavery that had marked the debates of the 1850s. It means that American settlers will settle the interior West now again in greater numbers, seeking a new life after the terrible strife of the Civil War. And it means that when the West's native inhabitants protest those intrusions, the federal government has more troops to deploy in response. For 4 long years, those troops have been engaged on the southern battlefields, and now they can be sent west. Gardner takes care to get his large view camera arranged just right in the midday sun. And then he summons his subjects. The 6 federal peace commissioners array themselves on either side of that young Indian girl. But they hold themselves awkwardly here, arranging themselves in a neat and peculiar, symmetrical order, as if to underscore the formality of their business. Only the child, for whom the camera is a strange and alien thing, she would not have seen one before, looks at ease. Gardner takes his negative back to Washington, D.C., and weeks later he makes his prints. And in a neat 19th century hand, which you can barely make out along the bottom of the slide, he labels them, naming his subjects from left to right. General Alfred Howe Terry, General William S. Harney, General William Tecumseh Sherman, John B. Sanborn, Colonel Samuel F. Tappet, General Christopher C. Auburn. He doesn't know the girl's name. He just calls her Arapaho. And with that word, he transforms a particular person into an anonymous one. Later, before he deposits his negative in a Washington archive, he changes his mind. And on the glass plate itself, barely make it out here, he inscribes the word Dakota. At some point, that long, jagged, lightning-sparkless crack strikes General Terry in his chest. Now there you have it. The visual evidence that on a particular day in May of 1868, 6 powerful white men sent west by the federal government stood outside Fort Laramie, arrayed themselves by a young Indian girl, while a photographer took their picture. An illustration of the peace treaty negotiations. That's how scholars have used this photograph in the past. But no historical document, not a literary one, not a visual one, has a single meaning. For Alexander Gardner, this photograph is a paid assignment. For the men, it becomes a personal keepsake. For the girl, she'd remember posing for the picture, but the photograph never circulated back to Indian country. She never saw it. Now the meaning of the picture becomes no more fixed in retrospect. Anthropologists might use it one way, historians of the Indian Wars, or biographers another. Generally as a simple visual illustration of an argument built from literary sources. This point might seem obvious to you, but it's one I need to make to my students all the time. It's possible to take a familiar document, or a story, or a person, or a place, and approach it with fresh questions. Because even well-worn evidence, like this photograph, can yield surprises. Now the picture you see here is not for me the truffle or the historical surprise, but it's the map that leads me to them. And it's a surprisingly large-scale map. In the terrain this photograph charts, I've found countless truffles, and okay, some toadstools. The most intriguing layout beyond the more obvious military and diplomatic subject matter of this picture, beyond the public stories so often told about these men, beyond the military experiences of General Sherman, who laid siege to Georgia during the final months of the Civil War, beyond the experiences of Indian fighters and Civil War generals, Christopher Auger or Alfred Terry, beyond the political activities of the abolitionist Samuel Tappan. If we walk way out into the truffle fields, we can decenter the map, and we can move away from the great man narratives that so often shape political history. We can tell stories that create a richer and more inclusive image of the past. But I find it hard to move too far away from General Harney. He's a short-tempered, violent man who directs his animus at everyone: Indians, blacks, women, Catholics, legal authorities, and particularly his poor, long-suffering wife. I have no wish to write about him. I don't need to like my subjects, but I need to have some empathy for them, and I find it hard to have any for him. But he comes here to Fort Laramie, trailing experiences and memories and stories that draw me back into the archives. And following him there, I've encountered stories about the slaveholding practices of frontier nuns and the European tour of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. I've met enslaved children and Indian concubines, French bishops, and this unnamed Indian girl wrapped in a blanket, and long ago consigned to anonymity in the archives. I've stumbled upon stories about violence, about race, about women lost to history, even about getting away with murder. Now, the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson famously referred to a photograph, you've perhaps heard this, as a decisive moment, the visual summing up of a complex set of events. But this picture is less interesting to me as a summing up, or as an artifact of interest in and of itself, which is the approach to photography I've taken in my past work, than as the entryway into a much bigger world whose existence is barely hinted at here. So let's start our exploration of that world. We're going to start with Harney's name and a first scrap of evidence that takes us back in time 3 decades to St. Louis in June of 1834. Don't worry if you can't read this. I'll let you know what it says. There's some disagreement about the details, but everyone concurs on the key points. Major William S. Harney whipped his slave Hannah to death. The details from the grand jury report leak out later. Harney held the young woman with his left hand, took a 25-cent piece of cowhide in his right hand, and did strike, beat, bruise, and cut, giving to the said Hannah then and there with the cowhide aforesaid, in and upon the head, stomach, sides, back, arms, and legs, several mortal bruises, of which she died. That detail about the cowhide strap lets people visualize the scene. A 6'3" military officer, a young woman, a cheap piece of rawhide transformed into an instrument of death. Head, stomach, sides, back, arms, and legs. The very list makes vivid Harney's frame of mind and the furious repetition of his strokes. Now, the main St. Louis newspaper covers almost no local news. To find out what's happening, you have to read the ads. If you want to track the local crime scene, for example, you look at the ads for the missing horses and stolen wallets. The city has a sheriff and a coroner who keep track of the drownings and the poisonings and the shootings. But the newspaper, the standard bearer of that city's booster spirit, rarely covers the bad news. And of Hannah's death, it says only this. An inquest was held at the dwelling place of Major Harney in the city on the 27th instant by the coroner on the body of Hannah, a slave. The jury, on their oaths, and after hearing the testimony of the physician and several other witnesses, found that said slave came to her death by wounds inflicted by William S. Harney. By local standards, that's actually a rather fulsome report. It counts as our first trouble. It's the beginning of the hunt. but it leaves much unexplained. So let's keep digging. In the newspaper, just a week before, in the ad section, Marni's name appears again. It's an ad for a runaway slave named Alfred or Albert, and it's our second truffle. And with a little archival investigation, it lets us more fully imagine Hannah's murder. Albert leaves Marni's home on Friday, June 20th, wearing white pantaloons and a black silk waistcoat, clothes that all but shout, "House slave." And in his haste, he leaves without shoes. It's a mistake he must regret as he runs out through the dirt lanes and granite block streets of St. Louis. Now, a slave escape always reflects poorly on the owner. Is he so lenient he cannot control his slaves? So harsh he drives them to desperate measures? This escape reflects especially poorly, however, on our friend Mr. Marni. He does not exactly own Albert, but he's responsible for losing him. Marni has charge of Albert while he and his wife Mary stay in the home of Mary's sister, Ann Biddle. Mrs. Biddle has gone to France for a few months, and she owns Albert. And when she goes abroad, she places him and her other slaves in Marni's care. Now, Mrs. Biddle is actually on her way home, and we can imagine Marni a frantic man. He has to recover Albert before she returns. So he takes out this ad in a local newspaper, describing the missing man as a dark Negro, who is low and slight, speaks little, and has a very submissive deportment. But just 2 days after running off, the ad tells us, Albert rides through the streets of St. Louis on a dark bay horse. Hardly the act of a submissive man. That's a public taunt, a humiliation of his temporary master. So how to get him back? Marni offers Albert a kind of family tree here. He explains that he used to belong to Colonel John Sullivan and later to Major Thomas Biddle. Slaves don't have last names of their own. You identify them by the names of their previous owners. He offers $40 for Albert's in-state, $20 for Albert's in-state capture, $40 to anybody who captures him out of state. Now, what can we as historians do with an ad like this? A novelist can leap to conclusions. Albert's escape makes Marni feel impotent as a slave master, driving him to rage and murder. But a historian has to follow along more slowly, compiling more evidence before connecting the dots. And digging deeper, we find a few more facts. We learn that the Marnis married less than 9 months before, and that they live in Mrs. Marni's sister's house, one of St. Louis's great mansions, because they don't yet have a home of their own. We learn that in this makeshift Marni household, enslaved people outnumber the free by roughly 3 to 1. The Marnis have responsibility for Mrs. Biddle's slaves, and at least 3 of their own, newly purchased from the estate of Mrs. Marni's father. So now we can picture it as historians. A borrowed home, a patched-together household of Biddle slaves and Marni slaves, and a white man and woman, now husband and wife, who hardly know one another. Now, Marni has spent much of the last decade in rough military camps. For him, this home must seem a gift. For his wife, Mary, who was educated in Paris and used to fine things, it would seem a kind of a promise, the sort of home she hopes for herself. But then the idyll ends. Albert runs away. And 6 days after that, with Albert still gone, Major Marni picks up a 25-cent piece of rawhide to whip his slave Hannah. She lingers overnight somewhere in the slave quarters of this lovely house. And then on Friday, June 27th, she dies. Now, who is Hannah? It's easy to find her at the moment of her death, but it's much harder to find her before that terrible moment. Like so many other enslaved people, she's difficult to track through the archives. But we know that in the 1820s, she belongs to a St. Louis grocer named John Shackford, and by the end of that decade, she's the property of John Malamphy, the father of Mrs. Marni and Mrs. Biddle, who was the richest man in all of St. Louis. Malamphy is an eccentric man and a generous one, a supporter of orphanages and hospitals and all things Catholic. And at some point before 1830, he turns against his slave Hannah. He sends her away to a distance, he says, for her improper conduct. Now, he might be sentimental about the white families that he helps through his various charities, but he's not sentimental about the enslaved family that lives inside his own house. Because when he sends Hannah away, he holds on to her young daughter, Fanny, who separates the mother and the child. Melanchthon does not exactly sell Hannah. He rents her out to a local plane maker named Moses Stout. And ruffling through the archives, we find another truffle. Of Hannah's life with the Stouts, we know only this. Mrs. Stout made Hannah some clothes. She spends $3.43 3/4 to purchase 6 yards of plaid linsey, 3 yards of brown cotton, and a dozen black buttons. And she spends another 50 cents to have a seamstress turn all of that into clothing. Finally, Mrs. Stout buys Hannah a new pair of leather brogans or work boots for $1.25. The cost of outfitting Hannah thus comes to $5.18 3/4. And after John Melanchthon's death in August of 1833, the Stouts bill his estate for the full amount. Why? Because those clothes represent an improvement to his property, and they want compensation. But if this receipt lets us imagine something about the economics of slavery, it also lets us imagine Hannah with more vividness. She's a real woman, a particular height and weight, and she has a plaid linsey dress and a pair of sturdy boots. At the Melanchthon estate auction of December 1833, Melanchthon's own daughter Mary and her new husband, William Marni, purchase Hannah and a small child. Perhaps the consequence of that improper behavior. But Hannah's other child, Fanny, remains behind, still the property of the Melanchthon estate. And 6 months later, Hannah, the mother, is dead. All sorts of stories about Hannah fly around town. 3 successive days of whipping. A rumor that she was kept tied during the time until her flesh was so lacerated and torn that it was impossible to say whether it had been done with a whip or a hot iron. Some think both, but she was tortured to death. Soon after that special coroner's jury meets in the Biddle House and indicts Harney for murder, a mob rises up against the army man. This is an extraordinary thing in a slave-holding city. It's a place where the culture of slave-owning runs deep. The crowd surrounds the house where Harney committed his awful deed and forms the resolution to take him into the bushes and leave him in precisely the same fix as he left the woman. Like us, that crowd draws conclusions from the bits of evidence they have at hand. And half a step ahead of that angry mob, Harney flees for his life. He's still on the lam that summer when a grand jury, convened by a man whose name Hollywood must have made up, a judge named Luke Lawless, follows the lead of the coroner's jury and also indicts Harney for murder. Seduced by the instigation of the devil, they say, he feloniously, willfully, and malice aforethought whipped her to death. Our little pieces of evidence now are beginning to connect us to larger historical narratives. We see small acts of slave resistance adding up to ever harsher treatment from a slave master. We see that harsh behavior stimulating even a crowd accepting of slavery to rise up, anxious about the very public violence in their midst. And we see the institution of slavery itself as coming under greater scrutiny as a system of social control. In early November of 1834, after 4 months on the run, Harney returns to St. Louis to face his accusers. Claiming local prejudice, he uses his influence to move the trial out of St. Louis to a local county about 50 miles away. And in March of 1835, 9 months after Hannah's death, he goes on trial for murder. Okay, finally, the courtroom scene. Now, in a work of fiction, this would be a grimly satisfying moment. We would be onlookers in the fictional courtroom. We could sit back and listen to the stories about Harney's temper, grimace at the graphic depictions of Hannah's injuries, watch Harney struggle to defend himself. But the historian has to rely on evidence, not simply imagination or a longing for a kind of satisfying narrative. And the real evidence? Scant. No court reporter transcribes what the witnesses say in court. No journalist covers the proceedings. We can imagine the state's case. Hannah's body offers evidence of violence, and 2 different juries have already indicted Marni for murder. What sort of defense could he possibly mount? We can infer it from a single document, a deposition given by someone who can't travel to the trial. A St. Louis lawyer, Josiah Spaulding. He's a calm and plain-spoken man, and he states that 6 or 8 years before, he'd been asked to look after the affairs of his friend John Shackford, while Shackford traveled back east, leaving his slave Hannah in the kitchen out in the yard. When Spaulding went to investigate a reported break-in, he found the Shackford house open and the bedroom drawers rummaged. And he, quote, had no doubt but that articles had been taken. Spaulding left to conclusions, and he went out back to confront Hannah. She was exceedingly impudent in words and manner, and Dakota thinks he caught up some kitchen utensil with intention of beating her, but she retreated and altered her tone. When he accosted her on that occasion, she approached him in a very bold and impudent way, and in a loud and insolent tone, denied his right to question her about the affair. Now, that is a satisfying moment for a truffle hunter, because we catch the faintest whiff of Hannah. We even hear a trace of her voice. She denied his right. No fumbling words about a misunderstanding, no grumbling apologies. Hannah stands up in her own house and tells Spaulding to get out. And he responds by picking up a kitchen tool and beat her. This helps us imagine Marni's defense. We can imagine him arguing he needed to discipline Hannah. He had to pick up that piece of rawhide to teach her a thing or two about being careful with the keys he accused her of losing. Now, state laws in Missouri prohibit the murder of a slave, but juries always accept corporal punishment as an acceptable form of discipline, and they would understand that sometimes punishment could have unintended consequences. The small-town jury deliberates only a few hours before rendering its decision. Not guilty. In the years to follow, Marni rises up through the military ranks, fighting Mexicans, killing Seminoles, battling all manner of tribes on the southern and northern plains, until finally he becomes a general in the Union Army, and later a peace commissioner, sent west to negotiate an Indian peace. If we draw one lesson from that not guilty verdict about the racial sympathies of an all-white jury, about the intimidating power of a military uniform, about the inability of enslaved victims to get a fair hearing in an antebellum Missouri courtroom, Marni likely tells himself another. His lesson: he can get away with murder. Now, when we follow Marni back into the archives, we not only encounter Hannah, his victim, we meet her daughter, Fanny, too. Remember for a moment, when John Melanphy, the rich philanthropic slaveholder and the father of Mrs. Marni, sends Hannah away for misbehavior, he holds on to her little girl. In his 72nd year, with Hannah rented out and little Fanny still living in his household, Melanphy writes a truly remarkable will. Another truffle for us. He gives away money to educate orphans, fund a hospital, feed the homeless. He specifies that the money given to his 5 living daughters is for their use only, and not their husbands. But he crafts his most unusual provisions for Fanny. On February 27, 1830, in the presence of 3 witnesses, Melanphy writes this: I give and bequeath to the Sisters of Charity in St. Louis, that is an order of nuns, a mulatto child called Fanny, now aged about 4 years. They are to learn her to read and write and treat her kindly. At the age of 18 years, the said Fanny shall be free absolutely, provided she shall in the meantime conduct it with propriety. And upon her marriage to some decent, orderly person, after she shall have become free, I give and bequeath to her the sum of $200. almost immediately, he dictates an addendum, explaining that he acts from commiseration for her destitute situation, as I have sent her mother to a distance for her improper conduct, and from the interest excited in me by the intelligence and smartness of the said Fanny, and from her frequent entertaining and amusing me with her innocent prattle. That is a remarkable statement. He follows it with a clarification, and he declares before God that he is not her father. Now, Melanthie provides handsomely in his will for his wife and children. He saves his most effusive words for little Fanny. If she is bound to him as a piece of chattel property, she's also bound by more effective ties. The little stories I'm telling here today about slavery, I think, help us understand this larger point. If the system of slavery is capacious enough to let Marni get away with murder, with Hannah's murder, it can also accommodate a slaveholder like Mr. Melanthie, who loves his slave. Now, Melanthie's will put the Sisters of Charity in an unusual position. It obligates them to raise and educate an enslaved child, something that would have been a challenge to do at their order house just a block from the courthouse steps in St. Louis, where slaves were sold in public. And it specifies that they must free her when and only when she comes of age. They can never forget that Fanny remains the property of the Melanthie estate. But I like to imagine they embraced her as one more parentless child who, despite her legal status, could benefit from their care and be brought into the faith. So if Melanthie is bound to little Fanny by love, I imagine the sisters bound to her by a sense of moral and religious duty. No records documenting Fanny's life with the Sisters of Charity survive. No photograph lets us glimpse her face. Aside from Melanthie's will, we catch traces of her in just 3 other documents. First, appreciate it's hard, this is very hard to read, but in 1845, Melanthie's heirs signed a document freeing Fanny, saying only that they acted for diverse good and valuable causes and considerations as thereunto especially moving. They don't mention that their father killed her mother. See here, Mrs. Harney signs for herself and for her husband, who does not sign the document himself. 2 more glimpses of Fanny, or at least the person I believe to be her. When the census taker knocks on the Harney family door in 1850, they encounter the Harney family living with a mulatto girl named Fanny, and I wouldn't make this one up either, Sin. Okay. Mary Melanthie Harney, the major's wife, it would seem, has brought Fanny into their household. She's brought her into the household of the man who murdered the girl's mother. She's known her for a long time, as a toddler in her father's house, as the child orphaned by her husband's murderous act. Why bring her closer now, this reminder of such a long and painful family history? Well, the Harneys had a very tempestuous marriage. They always threatened to divorce one another, fighting over money, bitter name-calling. They spend little time together. I think we can imagine Fanny bound to this family, not by contract or other legal means, not by a sense of moral obligation, but by Mrs. Harney's sense of guilt over her husband's behavior and her spirit of spite. She can punish her husband most by bringing into their household the little girl who reminds him of what he did. But actually, Mrs. Harney is no more a kind-hearted opponent of slavery than her father. I found just one last glimpse of the elusive Fanny. In February of 1860, from her temporary home in Paris, Mrs. Harney writes to a niece in St. Louis, "I hope Aunt Fanny is still with you. I see the city is going to be very severe on free Negroes. So much the better. The slaves will be better and more submissive to their owners." And with that, Fanny disappears from history. The larger point I want to make with these stories is that African American history lay around the edges of this photograph. They're embedded in it. These people don't forget about race when they come to a spot on the Wyoming prairies. There are lots of stories about slavery we can tell here. We can tell stories about General Sherman, who fought a war to help free the slaves, but couldn't imagine taking black men into his army. African American history doesn't unfold in some kind of parallel plane to mainstream American history or to Native American history. The peace commissioners we see here didn't shed what they knew about race and racial hierarchies when they came to deal with Indians. Now this photograph, of course, speaks to Native American history too. We're in Indian country here at these peace treaty negotiations in the spring of 1868. And as with African American history, the Indian history stories to be uncovered here are many and varied. General Sherman, for example, called on the U.S. Army to act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. But just a few months after this photograph is made, Mr. Tappan, whom you see here, actually adopts an Indian girl who was orphaned in the massacre at Sand Creek. He gives her his name and sends her to be educated in Washington, D.C. at Howard University. So there's no simple reconciling of those two different kinds of attitudes here. And it's hard, we must also acknowledge the previous acts of our friend Mr. Harney. He had actually fathered a half-Indian child up on the Wisconsin frontier in 1829. He was involved in trying to push the Winnebagos to a reservation west of the Mississippi. And he witnessed a treaty that allowed 4 mixed-blood Winnebago people to remain where they were and to obtain large grants of land. One of them was his 3-year-old toddler, Mary Caroline Harney. She got 640 acres of land and didn't have to move west with her mother's people. But let's turn from the story of that absent part Winnebago child to the girl we see here. Like so many Native American subjects of 19th century photographs, she's remained anonymous in the archives. But I think her name is Sophie Mousseau. At least that's what a grandson claimed about a century later. Sophie is born around 1860. She'd be about 8 or 9 here. She's born to an Oglala Lakota woman named Yellow Woman and her French-Canadian husband, the trader M.A. Mousseau. On the antebellum frontier, such interethnic marriages offer economic advantages to whites and Indians alike, marking a kind of middle ground where people can move and negotiate. At first glance, Sophie here seems the powerless one, doesn't she? She's short, she's young, she's female, she looks primitive in her dress. But it's too easy to overlook the real story of her life. To follow her back to the archives is to discover how large her life was, too. Her uncle actually became the premier of Quebec. So the peace commissioners you see here are not the only ones with connections to larger networks of political and diplomatic power. And General Harney's Paris-educated wife, she's not the only one to discover the charms of French. Sophie speaks French, too. She learned from her father, not from the French nuns. She also speaks Lakota and English, which means she's more cosmopolitan, at least linguistically, than any of the men you see here. Now, if I've thus far taken you sort of back into the deep background of this photograph, I just want to spend my last few minutes taking you forward and let us track Sophie's life. Let's use this as a springboard into a future. Around 1878, Sophie marries a rancher named John Ryan, an Irish-born Civil War veteran. He and Sophie have 5 children in 8 years, and then he falls in love with a white woman. He later murders her, but that's a different story. That's a different trouble altogether. In 1886, in what we might now term a parental kidnapping, Mr. Ryan takes the 5 children that he's had with Sophie, including an infant girl, and sends Sophie back alone to Pine Ridge. He dumped her on the reservation, a relative later recalled. Now, racial boundary lines are tightening in this post-Civil War West, and tolerance is fading for those mixed white and Indian families that once served as power brokers on the frontier. Ryan knows his part Indian wife has no chance to get her children back through the courts, and he takes them and raises them in a white man's world. Back on the Lakota reservation at Pine Ridge, Sophie remarries to a man named John Monroe. And like Sophie, he's the child of a white father and an Indian mother. But But the way racial politics is playing out now, he only has one identity, and that's as an Indian man. For a while, he plays it up, playing the role of a bloodthirsty Apache in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. There's some scant evidence that Sophie may have even joined him on a tour. In the summer of 1890, though, Sophie's in Pine Ridge. And she's there, living near Wounded Knee in late December 1890, when the U.S. Army massacres some 150 or more Lakota, mostly men and women, women and children, and the assault widely recognized as the end of the Indian Wars. Now, in Buffalo Bill's theatrical Indian Wars, the white folks were always the victims. Not so at Wounded Knee. Sophie's brother Louis runs the trading post in Wounded Knee, and he works as a translator, vainly trying to negotiate with both sides. It was a bungle and a botch, Louis Mousseau says later. No need of anybody being injured if it had been properly managed. Sophie has 11 children with her second husband. She actually lives till 1936 in a dugout on a rural part of the Pine Ridge Reservation, one of the very poorest parts of the Depression-riven nation. She dies in a simple sod home, a bearskin flat covering her front door, while the fierce Dust Bowl winds blow the topsoil west. So there you have it. A handful of stories gleaned from my truffle hunting adventures, all gathered in the terrain to which this photograph points us. But what do we make of them? If you bring the truffles home, you gotta know how to make the stew or the soup, right? Do they get us any closer to an understanding of 19th century American life than might the more conventional political, military, great man sorts of histories that this photograph suggests? I think the characters we've talked about today matter, in and of themselves, and because they help us understand larger, more abstract ideas in more concrete and visceral ways. Think about Hannah and Fanny, little Caroline Harney, the Winnebago child who inherits the land, and Sophie Mousseau. Think how they experienced the complicated meanings of race. We don't know about Hannah, the slave woman, but the others all have white fathers. It's usually the way it worked. And that white heritage operates differently for them depending on time and place. In Antebellum, Missouri, the mulatto child Fanny remains a slave even though her father is white. His race confers no privilege on her. But little Caroline Harney, the Winnebago child, she gets 640 acres of land because her father is white. So whiteness works differently in the African American history world than the Native American history world. A white racial heritage has a meaning that shifts over time. Sophie Mousseau operates comfortably in a world with a white father and a white husband. But in the years after Reconstruction, that mixed race world begins to fall apart, and she finds herself confined to a Lakota world of much more limited possibilities. To think about these stories, I think, is to be struck not only by the unsteady categories of race and rights in the 19th century U.S., the long and complicated histories of interracial couplings, but by the pervasiveness of violence in American life. Not just the industrial scale killings of the Civil War, represented by General Sherman or General Harney, but the more intimate kinds of violence experienced by Hannah, the murdered slave, or little Fanny, who grows up without a family, or Sophie Mousseau, who has her children ripped away and later endures a military assault on her community at Wounded Knee. And there's a kind of historical violence at work here too, a process that ensures that few records will survive to tell the stories of these people. I found Sophie Mousseau's descendants, those from her white husband and those from her Indian one. And actually, none of them even have a photograph that can confirm the family stories that that's who this is. The parachutists who write history about racism and slavery in American life, African American history, Indians, women, the violence of the Civil War, they might find these people as exemplars of their larger stories. But I think they probably wouldn't. To find people like this requires some pretty serious truffle sniffing. And I think it matters if we use these people's lives and imagine outward. Not just come to them because they represent an Indian girl living at Fort Laramie in 1868, but if we start inside of Sophie's head we can watch her world change, and we can understand the past in a different way. Now, small-scale history like this requires us to employ historical imagination. What is that? It's a bounded kind of imagination. History has rules. You're hedged in by the known facts, but you can speculate, you can take risks, and you can have empathy. You have to take imaginative risks of your own when you try to tell what happened in the past. Now, I wonder all the time about how the people I talk about today experience their own lives. Fanny, for example, the enslaved child given to the nuns. Was she happy? Devout? Bitter? Resourceful? The surviving sources don't tell us. We catch that final glimpse of her living as a young emancipated woman in the Harney household. Years later, she might have been bound to a spouse, to economic necessity, to the limited economic options available to an African-American woman in a slave-holding state. The archival trail disappears. But I can use my imagination. And I like to imagine Fanny, that child of the charming, innocent prattle. I like to imagine her free at last. But there, I've just overstepped the bounds of good history. To let Fanny be a successful entrepreneur, or to let General Harney rot in prison, where he deserved to be, I'd have to be a novelist. And for now, I'm sticking to my day job. But to all of you who like to read history, some of you here I know write it, I want to say this. You cannot be a historian if you can't imagine, at least sometimes. Stop there. Thanks so much.
If there are any questions, now is the time.
I wonder if you understand what's happening here. It goes all the way back to those ideas of white supremacy that starts off in our country, racial ideas and the black races, African Americans, and the people, and the white man's burden of the British. How much that figures into the equation?
The question is about the extent to which the racial ideas I've talked about here today actually have a much longer history of American history. Absolutely. They go back to the founding of our nation, to the invention of slavery as a system in the 17th century here. They have a long, troubled history. These people aren't inventing it. Yeah?
Do you have more information as to why is Sophie in that picture? Are there more pictures taken that day that would give us more information?
So the question is, why is Sophie here? And that's a fantastic question. I have to tell you that it took a very long time for me to figure out that it could be Sophie. It turns out that at the Fort Laramie Historical Site in Wyoming, they have a little file of comments left by visitors. And in 1973, so what, 30 or 40 years ago, somebody came through and said that it was his grandmother. It's just a little scrap of paper. That man is now dead, and I can't, in fact, find his relatives to find evidence of it. Why was she there? It's really hard to say. I do know that her family's ranch had been burned out by some bad Indians just a few weeks before, and her family had sought refuge in the fort. So there could be some kind of complicated parable here about protection, but I actually doubt the photographer would have known that. So it's a mystery. I don't know why she's there. Yeah?
You talked about Albert, the runaway slave who was sort of thumbing his nose by riding on this horse. Mm-hmm. Whatever happened to him?
It's completely unknowable. As I said before, enslaved people didn't have surnames before the end of slavery, so even if he lived a very long time and lived another 30 years till emancipation, it would be very difficult to connect up an African-American man named Albert with a particular surname to the Albert that we encountered 30 years earlier. So he too disappears from the record. Any questions? Yeah, go.
Could Hardy have been the father of Fanny?
No. Fanny was on the scene before Hardy married the wife. But some white man was
Yeah.
the father of the family.
actually been Chinese life.
Yeah, you have to wonder about Mr. Melanthi. He doth protest so much. Yeah.
Where did this whole idea of enslaving Afro-Americans in the United States manifest itself?
What, you're asking about the origins of American slavery?
Yeah.
Well, that would be a much longer lecture. But I think most historians would look at the very beginning of the British colony. Well, there was particular kinds of slavery in the Spanish colonies. There was a different kind of slavery in the British colonies, which becomes the model for antebellum slavery in the 19th century. In the beginning, white people and black people were both indentured servants, but over a period of time, there came to be a kind of racial dimension to that. And instead of being a limited period of indentured servitude, black people were enslaved for life, and their condition became heritable through their children. So it evolves very, very early, and slavery is acknowledged by the Constitution. It's written into the Constitution as a fact of American life. Yep.
I was wondering if in Canada, the offspring of European and Native marriages fared better than in the United States. Just a vague recollection that there was a term that was applied, and it was like an identity that grew up among such people.
Yeah,
I think it's
I
don't remember that.
Sorry. Yeah, I think the word you're looking for is Métis.
Yes.
And that is a recognized ethnic group in Canada. So, whereas in this country you were either white or you were Indian, just as you were either black or you were white, and those mixed race possibilities disappeared, they did remain viable and alive to this very day in Canada. That's a really good point to bring up.
Could one restore a parallel with the Geniceros in Mexico? Southwest?
Except that it's a lively political identity right now in Canada.
Okay.
So that would be a major difference. Yeah.
So, okay, let me give you an example, and then you can see if there's a question or not. I got a man named Gwynn writes a book called Empire of the Summer Moon, supposed to be about the Comanches. And then supposed to be. And you find out he never interviewed a single Comanche for the writing of the book. Then you read Tom Cavanaugh, who's the official Comanche historian, who says, well, Gwynn's book, I'll clean it up, is a bunch of caca. So, are we supposed to believe any of this, or is this entertainment, or where do you take this?
Well, I don't want to speak to the virtues of those particular two books, but I think that all historians have a lot to learn by interviewing the descendants of people involved in historical stories. And I will say that I am likely to be the first Princeton professor ever, or in future, or forever, to have placed an ad in Lakota Weekly Times. I wanted to figure out to possibly contact the descendants of this girl, so I sent the Lakota paper this photograph. I said that I'd come across some evidence that this might be so-and-so, and I would love to hear from anybody who had stories about her. And I did hear from both white descendants, well, I heard from the Indian descendants first, and they put me in touch with the white descendants, whom they've recently encountered, at least online. And I've been able to get a lot more stories about Sophie. But the oral history of their family is very limited when it comes to her generation. The next generation they have a lot of stories about. And the stories of her generation have pretty much disappeared. They only know that she was short, she was very dark complected for a girl who had a white father, and that she married a man who'd been in the Wild West. So I'm kind of on my own, unfortunately.
That was really a question that you raised back there. It's really a fairly important question. When you read those books you mentioned, they purport themselves to be histories of those times. I mean, how would someone know? I mean, those books are, at least one of them has footnotes, has research agenda to it. So how can someone discern whether it really is history or just something else? I mean, what's the...
So that's a great question. If you talk about you as a reader, when you read a book,
I'm not a historian.
how do you know how to trust the author? Well, I'm a professional historian, so I always read footnotes.
I mean, most books have footnotes, and the research, at least one of them did, I know. So if that's the case, I mean, it would seem to be credible.
I think the the mark of really good history is that you can figure out, reading backwards, what the pieces were, and you can understand why the author put them together to make the argument they did. That is, you can backtrack and see the component parts of the big structure. That's how I read history. I want to know, how did you figure this out? And I'll go back and say, oh, you figured out this, this, and this. Really neat idea to put them together in this particular way. Or I might read a book and go, whoa, where is this argument from? Where's your footnote? How do you know this? Or I read that document and it doesn't even say what you say it is. So just because a book is published doesn't mean it's good. Even if a book's a bestseller doesn't necessarily mean it's good.
They have the research agenda to it that seems to give it credibility. I mean, there's some book with no research agenda to it seems to be suspect no matter what. But if there's bibliography, if there's footnotes, and what I would see, it lends itself to some notion of human trust to some extent.
Well, you know, even at universities now, there's an argument about whether history should be a social science or a group of humanities. And I tend to think that it needs to be with humanities, because history, in a sense, is an art. You cannot know what happened that day. I've done a lot of work on this picture. I was very deep with some of it. I don't really know. Of course, I can't know everything that happened that day. I have to take what I know and invent a story. That's the humanist in me. It's not a social science where you can verify every single fact. History that is just fact, fact, fact is not fun to read. You have to be a storyteller to write compelling history. Dave?
You said that Sophie spoke English. She is on translation.
I looked into that, but I actually identified all the translators who were working here. She might have been an informal translator, but she wasn't one of the formal ones. Although we do know that women sometimes did work as translators for the Indian treaties negotiated around this time. I pursued that idea for a long time before I discarded it. Yeah.
So, can we assume that you just told us the stories about the people you wanted to tell us, but you're looking into everybody's lives?
Yeah.
And so, to historians use crowdsourcing, I mean, I'm just listening to this highly, interested group of people I'm surrounded by. I mean, is there a way that you can get the word out so that people can do some of this trouble hunting for you?
Well, that's actually the funnest part of my job, so I sort of hate to give it away. Yeah, I mean, there's so many amazing stories here. He actually guarded the boarding house where President Lincoln was dying and decided who could go upstairs and who could not. You know, he adopts this little Indian girl, names her, and educates her at Howard. But he's also married to this completely insane woman who's the leading mesmerist of the English-speaking world who does seances in the White House. I mean, the number of stories that can spill out of a single photograph are really amazing. And the challenge for me trying to figure out what to do with this is how to put those stories together and still bring them together to make a larger point. I'm working on that one.
Last question. Is that a cigar in his mouth, or is that a substrate?
Yeah. I've always just scanned it as a cigar, but I should probably be looking more carefully at better scans of the picture to figure that out. Yeah.
Since you've looked at all these individuals, is Sanborn related to the great insurance company that started?
No, he's becomes a senator from Minnesota and helps found the Minnesota Historical Society.
That was my second.
So it's a different fact.
Senator. Okay.
Anybody else? Yeah.
How much did you have to rely on microfilm, and how many of your sources were digitized?
Most of my sources are digitized now. I've been to the government records documenting the work of the Peace Commission that's microfilm, and the letters of these people surrounding their work, negotiating the treaty, those are on microfilm. But all of the 19th century newspapers that I've had occasion to use have been digitized, so it makes my life a lot easier.
You probably couldn't have done this 25 years ago.
It would have been, oh, actually no, the St. Louis newspaper is not digitized. Those Harmony things were up from 11 hours of microfilm.
Okay.
Thank you for giving me the chance to take credit for that.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Okay, last question.
Thank you for a great discussion. Really enjoyed it. We were just out at the Met and saw
I'm sorry.
we were just out at the Met to see the Civil War photographs, and it was amazing how many there were and where they actually find all these photographs over all these years.
Well, from the second it was over, and actually a few years before, the Civil War was a hot collecting field. So although the photographers who made those photographs during the Civil War, including Alexander Gardner, didn't necessarily make a lot of money in their lifetimes from those pictures, they were avid collectors from the get-go. And many of those collections have stayed intact. And so the Met borrowed from some bigger institutional collections for their Civil War show, but there's also a lot from private collectors. And their Civil War collectors are a very avid sort of public people. It's easy to track down those pictures. Well, thank you all so much.